Today, I bring you one of my personal favourite tales. A story I first heard many years ago when I was a young lad. Probably too young to hear this tale, and it may be for that very reason I developed a kind of morbid love and fascination for it. So without further ado, I present you a sinister Scottish tale, to be told by firelight on dark, dark nights. The Murder Hole. Some 500 years ago, in the southwest of Scotland, on a stretch of road that leads from Ayrshire to Galloway, there was said to exist a near endless moor. As far as the eye could see was boundless desolation, broken only by a scattering of bent and tortured trees. At the beginning of the road or path, there stood an old stone cross, bearing the marks of its age, and announcing to travellers that the moor had begun. Beyond the cross lay a ruin of a churchyard, abandoned and empty. It was said by many that no flowers would ever bloom in the churchyard, as it hung under the dark oppression of that evil land. Even during midday, the moor was dangerous and deceptive. The trail was covered in marshes and bogs, cleverly disguised as solid walking ground, patiently waiting to pull travellers and merchants to a claustrophobic end. Locals told that the safest time to attempt the harrowing journey was sunrise or sunset, as the rays of light would reflect from the hidden surfaces along the path and guide you more safely to the town on the far side of the moor. The road was not easy going, yet it was by far the better choice than dragging yourself through the stinking bogs and marshland, sinking over knee-high with each trudging step. At the midpoint of the road, there stood a small village of wooden huts, which at one point in history were bustling with humanity. People would dig and sell the great peat stores in the bogs, and generally lived quite well. But as the peat became further afield, and the harsh winters battered the land, many of the inhabitants left the village, and the cottages and huts fell to ruin. It became a forgotten, near forsaken place. In the surrounding area, there were whispers and tales of some strange evil on the moor, and in time, even the locals would become wary of the road, and would warn travellers never to leave the path if they attempted the journey. It was around this time that people began to go missing while travelling on the road. Every so often, a local or traveller would head out that way, and would not arrive on the other side. Those in the area would send search parties into the moor and to the mostly ruined village, but none of the remaining residents had any knowledge of the missing people, and no bodies were ever found. Local men hunted for caves or other hideaways, believing bandits might hide in the inhospitable land, but it was of no use. They found nothing. As the years went by, the frequency of these odd disappearances would only increase, forcing many of the fearful locals to leave the area. People told tales of blood-curdling screams emanating from the moor on dark nights. Others heard cries of help and anguish piercing the air before receding into the cold silence once more. A shepherd from the area, who had been out near the moor, returned home one evening with a terrifying account of how he had lost his way hunting for a wayward ewe. He found himself in an empty, featureless place, and in the distance he beheld three ghostly figures, obscured by the fog and darkness. It appeared to him that the figures were fighting or grappling with one another, and the struggle continued for some time with no obvious victor, until suddenly one of the shapes disappeared from sight with a hideous scream. It would seem that the shepherd's tale travelled quickly. Having heard the last of the evils on the haunted moor, The few remaining families from the destitute village fearfully packed their belongings and fled from the surrounding horror. Only one family remained in the village, an old woman and her 2 sons. They lived in an old run-down miner's cottage. They would not leave the moor, and told any who would listen that they were tied to the village due to poverty. Yet many of the locals suspected that this was only a ploy to farm donations from the more wealthy and kind-hearted villagers before the woman and her sons would eventually leave. But that was not to be. In fact, the old woman and her sons had found another way to supplement their income. They were now the only homely house in the moor, and any traveller or merchant wishing to pass that way would be forced aboard with them, since most had heard the evil tales of the moor and cared not to travel during the darker hours. The various travellers became well aware of the tales surrounding the road, and would gather before the moor and take to the road in numbers in the hope of securing safe passage. They would travel all day, and by evening would stop in the only home the village had to offer. It was not much, but a locked door and a well-stoked fire can do wonders for a terrified traveller. During the evenings, the sons would tell sickening horror stories of the moor and the evil spirits which haunt it. Then, after a sleepless night in the evil land, the travellers would gladly pay their hosts for their hospitality and continue their journey through the evil moor. But not all heeded the warnings, and every so often a man would travel alone along the moor road, and it is here where our tale truly begins. One dark, stormy night, a young peddler who had ignored the warnings and tales of the moor travelled the path alone. It was not his first time taking the moor road. A year before, he had travelled with a group of other merchants and sellers, so he believed he was more than acquainted with the path and had the knowledge he required to complete the journey alone. As darkness began to fall around the boy, and the harsh storm winds battered his near-frozen face, he spotted the faintest glimmer of light in the distance, and knew he was approaching the cottage. Desperate for a heat, he ran the remainder of the way. The last time he and the party stayed with the woman and their sons, they received a warm welcome, and the woman told tales of the Vua and other dark creatures. It appeared that she had taken a liking to the boy, and even begged him to stay another night, but the peddler had to leave and continue his journey. The young man was gleeful as he reached the cottage, and sharply rapped up on the door, but no one answered. Even over the wind, the boy could hear a great deal of thumping and talking from within. He wondered if he was too late, and the woman and her sons were fearful he may be a wicked creature of the night, or a strange evil come from the moor. The peddler walked round the house, and saw light streaming from a window. As he peered in, the boy saw the old woman scrubbing the stone floor, and strewing it thickly with sand, as her 2 sons heaved what seemed to be a cloth bundle of some weight into a large chest in the corner of the room. The boy tapped upon the window to gain their attention, and all 3 jumped, as though the tap had been a bolt of lightning. They glared menacingly at the boy, who returned a puzzled look. They had been so welcoming in his last visit. Before he had time to think, one of the men burst out of the cottage and grabbed the boy, dragging him inside. "I'm not what you take me for," said the boy, forcing a half-hearted laugh. "Only the poor peddler who visited last year." "Are you alone?" inquired the old woman, in a harsh yet deep tone. "Yes," said the boy. "I'm alone here, as I am in the wide world also." "Then you're welcome," said one of the men, with a sneer, while he cast a glance at the other inhabitants of the cottage. The young man was brought closer to the warm flames of the peat fire, yet he still felt a cold shiver race through his body. His earlier carefree attitude had all but left him. He now saw a more sinister aspect to the 3 lonely villagers. Nevertheless, he was here now, and safe within the walls, and the fleeting fear of his hosts was most probably unfounded. Once the boy had partaken of some soup and warmed himself by the fire, the sons led him down the shabby corridor to what seemed to be a ransacked room. The curtains hung in tatters, broken furniture lay strewn about the floor, and marks of violence could be seen around the bed. The peddler, becoming ever more apprehensive, begged for a candle to burn to ease his sleep. This request was grudgingly granted, and the son returned with a lit candle, and then left the boy to his mess of a room. At first, the boy thought that the house had seen some unruly guest or vagrant, but bringing the light closer to the door, he found that the lock and latch had been broken. Filled with unease and riddled with anxieties, the boy climbed into bed and attempted to calm his mind. He had travelled far that day, and on a very difficult road in poor weather. This had all taken its toll on the boy, and soon he was in a deep sleep. But his sleep was far from restful. All night the boy was plagued by images of violence and terror, wicked creatures in an endless moor, hundreds of howling ghosts, warning him to leave this place and never return. He was lost within the madness of his dreams, trapped there for near eternity, never to escape the enveloping darkness. Then suddenly he heard a tormented cry and woke with a start. There he lay in the torn bedsheets, covered in an icy cold sweat. He could hear nothing, but in the remaining candlelight he saw movement at the bedroom door, and to his horror a thin stream of crimson blood began to flow silently beneath the entrance. Filled with pure dread, the boy crept from the sheets and peered through a crack in the door. He saw then a goat laying dead upon the floor, and his heart lifted, and he took a deep breath. The sons were butchering this creature for food. His imagination and dreams had truly got the better of him, or at least that is what he believed, until the boy overheard the brothers' conversation. "This is an easier job than you had yesterday," said the man who held the goat. "I wish all the throats we've cut were as quick and easy as this one. Did you ever hear such a noise as that old man made last night? It is well we have no neighbours within a dozen miles, for they must have heard his cries for help and mercy." "Don't speak of it," replied the other. "I was never fond of bloodshed." "Oh, you do you?" laughed the first. "I am quite the same," he continued. "The murder holds the thing for me, that tells no tales. A single scuffle, a single plunge, and then the fellow's deed and buried in a moment. I would defy all the officers in Christendom to discover any mischief there." "Aye," spoke the other wistfully. "Nature did us a good turn when she contrived such a place as that. Who that saw a hole in the heath, filled with clear water, and so small that the long grass meets atop it, would suppose that the depth is unfathomable, and conceals more than 40 bodies? It takes them in, like a great voracious maw." The old woman entered the room, and called, "Will you two stop yapping, and tell me how do you mean to dispatch the lad in the next room?" The elder son fired a glance at his mother, and held a finger to his lips, while pointing to the now trembling boy's room. The man, with a wicked smile, looked at the woman, and with his knife in hand, motioned it across his throat. Inside, the peddler boy stood motionless. With his mind racing, he had no idea of what to do. The men meant to kill him, or take him to some hideous murder hole in the moor, but it was not the time to stand still. If the young boy had learned one thing in his lonesome travels, it was that there was a time to fight and times to fly, and he could not see himself overpowering the brutish brothers. So with all haste and silence, the boy crept to the window, and applying some force to a rusty latch, pried it open. Then, with little grace, he clambered over the sill and dropped into the dark moorland. It was there his blood froze, as a shout rang out from within the house. "The boy's fled," called one of the brothers. "He must have overheard us. Quickly, loose the bloodhound." "Make sure he does not escape," cried the old woman. "Do not return him here. Let him lie in the murder hole." The door of the cottage flew open, and a great black hound bounded forth, followed quickly by the two sons. The boy ran into the darkness of the moor, as if the very devil himself was at his back. He stumbled and fell into the stinking marshland, but forced himself up and continued to flee. He could hear the dog gaining on him, and in the distance he could see the lanterns of his pursuers. He redoubled his efforts, running blindly through the foul moor until his foot caught a large stone, and down he went, cutting his hands and legs upon the sharp rocks that lay hidden within the bog. He lay stunned and bleeding in the marsh. Looking up, the lanterns were closing in, and he could hear the panting of the dog. For a final time, the boy pushed himself up and hobbled into the darkness. The hound came upon the bloody rocks where the boy had stumbled, and began to bark and yelp, then with some thirst began to lap the blood. When the brothers arrived and saw the dog, they bade it continue the chase, but the hound would not move, and resumed his lapping of the blood. The men, in a foul anger, cruelly beat the poor creature, and in fear of their wickedness, the dog bolted into the darkness, leaving the men alone to scour the moor. The peddler did not know of his luck, and battered and bleeding, he continued his wild scramble out of the moors. As dawn broke, the boy reached the town on the far side of the moor, and in a frenzy began beating upon any door he could see. Eventually, the townsfolk managed to calm the boy, and while tending to his wounds, they heard his disturbing tale. It finally dawned on the townsfolk that it had been the woman and her sons who were responsible for all the disappearances, and many had lost close friends or family members. So in a great fury, the people of the town banded together, and marched upon the evil road to the woman's house, whereupon she and her sons were roughly dragged from the premises, and taken to the town to be tried. It was all some of the townspeople could do to stop others from killing the three on the spot. Tempers and emotions were raised all throughout the town, but eventually a trial would take place. The three confessed to over 50 murders. For years, even before the village had went to rack and ruin, the family had been killing locals and travellers, all to steal their coin purse and valuables. It was by this method that the evil woman and her twisted sons had made a living. They were forced to show the villagers the site of the murder hole, and it was, as they said, a small, unremarkable puddle covered in the long grass of the moor. Yet it was far deeper than any walking stick which the folk had brought with them. Leaving a marker by the murder hole, the party returned to town, and on the morning of the next day, the woman and her two sons hung from the gallows for their unforgivable crimes. The peddler boy would heal from his wounds, and return to his travels, selling his wares here and there. But until the day he died, he would never forget the terror of that night, and would never remove from his mind the disturbing horror that is the murder hole. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and helping me keep these tales alive. The devilish dealings in the moor and the nightmarish murder hole is a tale that has existed in Scotland for over half a millennia, and in all that time it has picked up many tangential stories and appendices, only a few of which I will share with you now. It was said in some versions of the tale that the townfolk and the men from the surrounding villagers would return to the murder hole with rope and hooks, and spent days fishing out bones and cloth from the vast depths of the hole. Many think that there were far more bodies hidden in the depths than was admitted to, but it was impossible to know for sure, as the hole was too deep and the marsh too wicked. In another version of the tale, the boy recites prayers to God before embarking on his journey, and while he travels the road, and it was only by these devotions that he survived. Although I personally find that a little paradoxical, that God had rescued the boy from the 3 evildoers, although allowed over 50 men to brutally drown in the murder hole, but that's just my opinion. Some say that the moor was truly haunted, and that the spirits of those left to rot in the murder hole can still be seen in dark nights in the west of Scotland. Some of the lingering spirits seem to be kind of nature, and will warn you of the bogs and marshland, or enter your dreams like the young man in our tale, and advise you on how to leave the moorland, while others are purely spirits of anger and vengeance, looking for any unsuspecting traveller in the moors to drag them down to an icy cold death beneath the desecrated land. It was said by many that screams can still be heard echoing on that land, and that this may suggest the presence of a Bene Yee or the Glastig. You may have heard tell of the murder hole by the Scottish novelist S.R. Crockett, who places the hole at the west inlet of Loch Naldrican and features the murderous tale in his book The Raiders. But we know for a fact that this location was entirely fiction by the author's own words. But this brings me to an interesting point. Did the murder hole actually exist? And if it did, where? It is a particularly difficult question, as this tale has existed for so long, and many are unsure if it is purely a story or a recounting of true events. In my opinion, the truth may lie somewhere in between. It is quite odd that the tale seems to have no author, and there is no one credited as the first to tell the tale, no person or family linked with its beginning and spread, and it seemed to already be well known by the 17th or 18th century, although it does for the most part seem to have begun in the very area it tells of. And not only that, but many people have suggested that the evil road may be the old path between Glentrool and Straighton village in the south of Ayrshire, which may be a reason for the haunting nature of the moor, since it was very close to where the Battle of Glentrool happened, and the land must be littered with the bodies of soldiers who died in that conflict. But the honest answer about the truth of the murder hole is that we just don't know. As I said in the beginning of this video, the murder hole holds a special place in my heart. As odd as it may sound, it is one of the stories that led me to make this channel, and I hope I have done it some justice. For my part, I believe that somewhere out in the moorlands in the southwest of Scotland, there sits a grass-covered puddle that plunges into a vast unending hole, filled with the bodies of villagers and travellers. Who knows, the site of the ruined village could be rebuilt now as city houses or country cottages. Perhaps one still invites guests, be it an inn, a hotel, or an Airbnb. Perhaps the owners of that fine establishment still make a living by feeding the murder hole. But enough from me. Enjoy your summer, and if you're taking a trip, may I suggest Scotland. Slán va.